Well, we did it, folks. We're at video 50. Although technically it's 51 because I cocked everything up because I came out on Tuesday when I wasn't going to because of the weather. And I thought that would have been 48. It was 49. Then I came out yesterday and that would have been 50, but I cheated and made that 49A. So today's 50 and it's going to be Star Wars because that's what it was going to be. It was going to be yesterday, but like I say, I can't put the number in. So it's going to be today. I'm going to get this done. But we'll get to that when we get to the park. I don't want to start talking about it and having to stop, because this is just like a little intro walk, the warm up as it were. Oh, quite chilly this morning. Oh, God almighty. So anyway, been playing a bit more of Gran Turismo 7 Power Pack add-on. Played it quite a bit yesterday and yeah, it's not really doing anything for me, guys. I think I wasted my money there. Yeah, Gran Turismo 7 Power Pack, not doing anything for me. Put another couple of hours into it yesterday. Not overly impressed. Quite disappointed with it, if I'm being honest. Probably break off and play something else. I do feel like I've wasted my money with it. I'll probably carry on. If I'm playing it, I'm going to finish up the normal game mode, of which I've got a handful of races left before I've completed that. But aside from that, no, the power pack's just not working for me. It's not doing much for me. I find the races boring. They fall into the same sort of routine. The AI is dreadfully predictable. So, yeah. If you're into the hardcore racing stuff, yeah, probably, but not for me. Anyway, I'll see you at the park. Right. There we go. All right, let's get going. So, 50th episode. Favourite movie of all time, or movie series of all time to be accurate, is without doubt in my mind the original Star Wars trilogy. Star Wars was the first film that I ever saw at the cinema. And I was like 3 or 4 years old. My dad took me to see it when it came out here in the UK on its first run. Believe it or not, I have a couple of snippets of memory. I remember being at the cinema. I remember my dad getting me a Darth Vader mask. They were selling a little plastic mask. And I remember getting a programme as well. Back then, with the release of movies like Star Wars, they actually would sell a programme, a little booklet, or in the case of the Star Wars one, it wasn't so little, and it would have stills from the movie and a bit of information. Contained within that were some shots that weren't actually in the movie. I had that book for quite a few years, until I think I was about 8 or 9. One Christmas, I'd been reading it because I'd got some Star Wars figures and Star Wars vehicles for Christmas that year. So I got the book out, was reading it, and I'd eaten too many sweets, and that night I was sick. I just leant over the side of the bed, as you do when you're a little kid, and threw up. Unfortunately, right onto that book, right onto that programme, so it ended up being thrown out. And I dare not look at how much that would be worth today. Not that I would have sold it, absolutely not. But out of curiosity, oh God. Yeah, what a way to kick off. But yeah, you got to kick off at the beginning of Star Wars for me, and that was being taken to the cinema by my dad to see it. So to give you like the brief overview, now I never got to see Empire Strikes Back at the cinema. Wonderful. Do you ever get the feeling you planned something and then people get on your nerves? That's kind of what that is. Anyway, getting back to it, I never got to see Empire Strikes Back at the cinema for some reason. I never got taken. But I did see Return of the Jedi with my then best friend in 1983 when it opened. My mum took me to see Return of the Jedi. Now, my best friend, he had, it wasn't a novelisation, it was like an annual, we used to call them. I don't know if you call it that in the US, but in the UK we would call them annuals, which were like a collection of comic books that would come out at Christmas in a hardback edition. And he had The Empire Strikes Back. Now, that was actually in 2 parts. I had the second part, which had storylines and characters that didn't actually feature in the movies, or the main characters did, but the second one was like detailing them trying to retrieve Han Solo. So the first Empire Strikes Back annual was just the story of the film in comic book form, and the second one was detailing Lando, Leia and Luke on the hunt trying to retrieve Han. And it sort of detailed also Lando going to Jabba's palace. It's kind of how it ends, with him going to Jabba's palace to infiltrate there. So I was able to catch up on the story. So when I watched Return of the Jedi, I wasn't confused as to what had happened. You know, why was Han in Jabba's palace? What happened to Luke's hand? And of course, Vader being Luke's father. Now, it was a bit of an anticlimactic way to find that out. One of the most pivotal points in cinematic history, certainly at that time. One of the biggest reveals, and probably one of the most shocking reveals, I actually didn't see. I actually read in this annual, yeah, great Star Wars fan, right? I blame my parents completely for not taking me to see Empire Strikes Back. I actually didn't see Empire until it came out on home video. I think it was around 1985 in the UK. 84, 85, it was around then. And that was the first time I saw Empire. I saw it after Return of the Jedi. So, yeah, what a messed up way to have seen the original trilogy. But, hey, didn't actually change my love of it. In fact, in a bizarre way, it kind of, I don't want to say made me a better fan, but it kept my interest going. But I just remember loving those movies. Well, I don't remember because I still do. That pure action adventure. And even as a little kid, the emotion of it, you know, I felt a very emotional connection to those films. To that original trilogy, and I still do. You know, the sort of more adult themes of Vader, you know, being Luke's father and his fall to the dark side and his redemption, perhaps as an adult can carry a little bit more emotional resonance, as it's a representation of the kind of struggles we all face. But even as a kid, you know, it kind of hit hard. And it was because it was a great story. And the characters you cared about. You know, as a kid, Han, Luke, Leia, Chewie, you cared about. Because they were well-written characters. And they were good people. They did the right thing. You know, it was an age really where, you know, it was heroism. And it was a very, very, how can I describe this? There was a morality to it all. Luke always did the right thing, even at a great cost to himself. that comes out in Empire Strikes Back. You know, he cares about his friends, he cares about people, he's a good person and a good role model for people, especially for kids to look up to. And that was impactful to me as a child growing up. The importance of having, you know, good heroes is vital, it's important. But the movies were just great. I mean, you know, on a pure action adventure level as a kid, the excitement, the special effects, everything. It was great. It was awesome. Adrenaline pumping. And I couldn't watch that film enough. Around 1984, my mum and dad got a VCR, our first one. Prior to that, my sister would bring hers around. But by then, my mum and dad would bring my sister would bring hers around occasionally to my mum and dad to watch a film. She was a member of a local video rental club. So, you know, it was great. We would, you know, she would bring it round like on a Friday night or something, along with a film or two. And then my dad eventually was like, we need to get one of these. My dad loves films. You know, I get a lot of my love of movies from my dad. You know, I've said before about Friday night was movie night. My mum would go out to the flower arranging club and me and my dad would sit there and watch films, watch a couple of movies that he would rent out. Where I lived, back in the 80s, there was only one cinema near us, and it shut down. It shut down in the mid-80s. It never reopened. So it wasn't actually until I got older and was able to drive to an out-of-town cinema complex that I actually started frequenting the cinema. Most of my childhood intake of movies, for the vast majority of the time, except on the odd occasion, was through home video. That was just the way it was. My dad worked shifts, so he wasn't always available, and my mum didn't drive. Return of the Jedi, when I saw that, was one of the last films that I saw at that cinema. In fact, I think the following year it closed. I think the following year, I think it was then, my dad took me to see Conan the Destroyer and he wouldn't let me in. And my dad had an absolute fit at the guy at the ticket office. Because I was like 10, 11 years old at the time. And my dad was like, I'll decide what you can and can't watch. It was so funny. He's there like being a proper, I want him to see it, he'll see it. I'll never forget that. I was just stood there like, oh God. can we either let us in or can we go? But we ended up so yeah, it was funny. I did ultimately end up seeing it, but God, he was like, my dad back then had quite the temper. It was funny, except when you're on the receiving end of it, like I was quite frequently. Like he used to get shouted at quite a lot. But yeah, it was that was it for me. So when we got the VCR, it was like, okay, what do you want to watch? So I remember going with him to the local video store and Star Wars. Every time, it used to drive him mad. And I used to try and trick him, because I would say, look, it's a new one, look, it's episode 4. It's called A New Hope. That worked once. And we sat watching and he goes, it's the same film. I was like, oh, yeah, I know, but I really like it. So it must have driven him mad. Because he obviously wanted to watch something else. But it was that way then I got to watch Empire Strikes Back for the first time, which was at home. We had a big TV for the day. It was this big, I would say by today's standards it's not, but by the standards of the day it was. For a CRT, it was a 28-inch Hitachi television. So it was quite big for the day. And yeah, watched Empire Strikes Back for the first time on there. Absolutely loved it. Absolutely loved it. Because there was stuff obviously in the film that wasn't in the annual, because the annual is only a summary. It's like the highlights. So there was a lot of stuff in there that wasn't actually in the annual. And of course, back then as a kid, my favourite scene was the Battle of Hoth with the AT-ATs, or AT-ATs. We called them AT-ATs. That was awesome. As a kid, I loved War of the Worlds. I had the Jeff Wayne's album, which used to scare. It's like really scary when I was a little kid when it came out. But I was like, really loved it. And the AT-ATs reminded me of the Martian tripods. But obviously they're four-legged. But they were so frightening. And it was the way that they cleverly animated it, because it was stop motion, obviously. But it gave them that really spooky, otherworldly appearance. You know, that sort of jerky movement. Not like today, they would be really smooth and mechanical, and to the eye, it wouldn't be anywhere near as impactful for me. That sort of stop motion jerkiness of these giant machines sort of lurching towards you, and Rogue Squadron's there with the snow speeders, and they're shooting at these things, and the blasters are just having no effect. You know, the armor of these things is too great. I guess they were shielded. And you think, well, yeah, these things are not going to be able to shoot the snow speeder down. They're too slow. You know, they don't have turrets on them. You know, bit of a design flaw there, Empire. But they did. You know, they arranged themselves in such a way that they were able to put up like a flak barrage with their lasers, and they did take out a number of snow speeders. Is that bit where one sort of General Veers is AT-AT sort of like always stuck out. It kind of does this weird posture. It like drags one of its legs back and tilts at an angle, and they nail a snow speeder coming in, and it just like goes spinning off and blows up, and then within seconds it fires like its main laser barrage and blows up the shield generator. And then you think, oh, these AT-ATs are lethal. You know, I mean, in the day, the special effects were obviously limited with the stop motion, but it just gives you the idea that these things were actually more agile than they looked. You know, that they were, and their laser targeting system must have been really, really awesome to be able to target and nail a snow speeder like that. So, as a kid, that was always my favourite bit. But it was the build-up to it. It was the build-up to that battle. You know that the Empire have arrived, and the rebels are trying to evacuate the base. And it shows you inside the base, and it's like R2's going along, and a bit of snow and ice lands on his head, and you hear that comms transmission, Imperial walkers. I think he says something like on the South Ridge or something. And you're like, okay. And then it cuts outside to the guy, and you can hear them. Initially, you hear them, but you don't see them, because obviously they've kicked up a lot of snow when the ships have landed. So there's like a cloud in the distance, but you can hear something coming. And then when it cuts to it again, there are just these very tiny looking things in the distance. And you think, if you can see them from that far away, and then next, when it cuts to it next, it's like, oh my God, it's like huge AT-ATs are coming. It was the build-up to it. Brilliant filmmaking. And it, again, though, it wasn't a huge land battle. There wasn't like hundreds of these things. I think there's like 5 or 6 with an ATST supporting it. But then it's the build-up. It's all it needed, and it's like, Rogue Squadron. It's just a small number of fighters. And less is more. That battle is one of the most intense battles in all of Star Wars. And it was the same in the original movie, the attack on the Death Star. It's a relatively small number of rebel pilots. This isn't like thousands of ships. It's subtle. It's intense. You focus on pilots. You recognise the pilots. They have time, enough screen time, so you feel the loss when they get killed, when they get shot down. Like in the original cut, Biggs is only referenced by Luke on Tatooine when he tells his aunt when he wants to go and to go to the academy, and his name's referenced. That's it. And then the next time you see, the first time you see Biggs, he's in an X-wing. Now, for everybody who's only ever seen Star Wars post-97, you see Luke and Biggs reunite before they take off on the mission against the Death Star. But in the original, that scene's not in the film. But it was still impactful when Biggs gets shot down and killed. It was still impactful even in the original one. There was enough time, even the brief moments that they were in. Oh God, that's Biggs, that's Luke's friend. and he gets killed. You know, Gold Leader, Red Leader, Porkins, all of these ones that you spend enough time with these pilots briefly in the combat so you actually feel it, because it's not this huge overblown action fest where there's like a million ships and you just don't have any time at all with any of the crew, any of the pilots. And that carried over to Return of the Jedi. The big battle of Endor, which was much bigger, but you still remember pilots from it. You remember what they did. And that was what I mean. There was an intensity to the action. You felt the desperation. You felt the stakes. You felt the loss. It wasn't something that was... You weren't told to feel it. You just felt it. Because it was a really well-made film. With deep characters. I remember when I watched the end of Return of the Jedi, that was it. And to all intents and purposes, it was finished. The Emperor was dead, Vader was dead, Luke had survived, Han and Leia had. They'd won the day. And then it was just over to the expanded universe then, and video games for me. But Star Wars just always remain there. They come out with the digitally remastered versions, not the special editions. Digitally remastered versions on VHS. They were black VHS cases with new artwork on them. The artwork was beautiful. I've still got them stashed away at home. And I watched those films over and over again. I got them Christmas. And I watched them films over and over again. It was the restored versions of the original movies. And then in 1997, George Lucas released the special editions at the cinema. And this was a chance for me to right a wrong. You know, all of a sudden I'm no longer reliant on other people. I could go to the cinema. And I went and I watched them in order. The first time at the cinema I saw Empire Strikes Back. Now, for the most part, the special editions are great. It was good to see improvements as they were back then to the effects. But there were some things I didn't like. The scene with Han and Jabba in Star Wars, I always thought was daft. It doesn't work. Jabba's supposed to be a terrifying gangster. He's supposed to be the Don Corleone of the Star Wars universe. He's a crime lord. You know, he's not anybody that you mess with. You know, when you watch the original trilogy, you know, in the first two movies, he is this looming threat over Han Solo. But when they did the special editions, they added a deleted scene that was removed before the original movie was released back in the 70s. And that scene doesn't work. Back then, Jabba was played by a Scottish actor. He was a man. He wasn't a giant space slug. He was a man. And in that scene, Harrison Ford is acting as if he's acting to a guy, a big guy. And there's the scene where as he's talking with Jabba, he walks around the back of him. And in the special edition, because they put that scene back in, they had him step on Jabba's tail. And Jabba does this sort of really comical facial expression of like, you know, it's supposed to be like pain. It's like somebody's just stood on his tail, which would be hugely disrespectful. That would be like being in the presence of the Godfather, Don Corleone, and taking you're wearing some leather gloves and you take them off and you slap him around the face with them. Like, you wouldn't get out there alive. He'd have you taken out and shot, regardless of your relationship. It's like the ultimate act of disrespect. And I just thought, Jabba's not really a terrifyingly bad person anymore. He's a bit of a weako. He's a bit comic. You know, he's not intimidating anymore. Because he doesn't even say anything. You know, he doesn't even have his henchmen there, you know, grab Han and whatever for the disrespect. He doesn't even say anything, doesn't acknowledge this slur. And I just don't think they should have put that back in the film. I think they should have left it out or found a better way of doing that scene using editing so Han doesn't walk behind him. Certainly more recent times, they could have fixed it. I mean, in The Phantom Menace, they do swap Obi-Wan Kenobi on board the Queen's ship when they're fleeing Naboo. In the commentary, George Lucas mentions the fact that Obi-Wan was in a different position and they digitally moved him to a different place in the cockpit. So even back then, when they were doing Phantom Menace in 98, 99, came out in 99, so they'd have been working on that type of stuff back in 97, 98, which is a year after the special editions came out. They had the technology to do that. And they should have done something with that scene, because it's bloody awful. It's an interesting scene, but it doesn't work. And so it should have been left out. There were other things as well that was put in there. Not so much, not on that level.
Rescue. Come on, Mike. I looked after his brain house.
But there's one, obviously the main controversial scene was Greedo. Han. George changed that scene for Greedo shooting first, which completely changes the character of Han Solo. It doesn't work. Han goes on a character arc. He is selfish. He's a pirate. He's a rogue when we meet him. He's out for himself. He wants money, and a lot of it. That's the only reason he's helping at the start. He keeps making references to it. He wants not only to pay off Jabba, but he wants to be wealthy. He says, I'm not in this, for your rebellion. I'm in this for me. I'm in this for my money, for the money. You know, his character then would have just taken the money and gone, left him to it. The fact that he comes back at the end of Star Wars and saves Luke, that's his character arc. He's very ambiguous, you know. Han's trying to lure Luke away. You know, come with us. You're good in a fight, we could use you. You know. And then, you know, Chewie says something to him. You don't know what Chewie says because there's never any subtitles for Chewie's dialogue, thank God. And Han is like, I know what I'm doing, as he's loading up what looks like the money, his reward. He's loading containers which you assume is full of Republic, or full of, wouldn't be Republic, it would be full of, well, riches. Whatever it is that would pay Jabba off. He's loading that up. Han shooting Greedo first shows he's ruthless. So it was such a stupid edit that George did, having Greedo shoot first. And he's never really backed down on it. They pretty, you know, he kind of, his biggest thing was to compromise and have them shoot simultaneously, which is still wrong. Greedo doesn't get a shot off in the original. Greedo implies he's going to shoot. He goes, you know, I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Han says, yes, Greedo, I bet you have. And then Han shoots him from under the table. It's a sneak shot. Takes Greedo out. Greedo doesn't even get a round off. George tried to say, oh, he did. It was just the way it was edited. Bullshit, George. Greedo did not fucking get a round off. See, you made me drop an F-bomb in my video now. So as much as I enjoy the special editions for what they bring, you know, certain improvements, certain visual effects have been improved, which is great. Thankfully, they didn't replace the 8080s with a smooth CGI version. That would have completely ruined that scene for me. But they did other improvements, which was good. They brought things in line. I know, even after the special editions come out, he carried on tampering with it. After the prequels come out, they replace the original actor for Darth Vader in the end. Not Hayden Christensen. They added in Christensen. They added him in afterwards, after the Revenge of the Sith came out, when they released the trilogy on Blu-ray. George went and tampered even more, which was infuriating. There were some good changes, like Boba Fett. They changed his dialogue now to match that of Tamora Morrison, who was the voice of the clones and therefore was the voice of Jango Fett. And so yeah, that made sense to change his voice. But there were some changes which I don't agree with. Until they remove Greedo shooting at all and restore it back to Han shooting first, that will forever be a bone of contention with me. I'll never accept that because it fundamentally spoils a character's arc. Not a character's arc. It kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense for young Anakin to appear as Anakin's Force ghost. If you think about it, the people will say, and I don't know whether George actually said it himself, but people would say things like, well, you know, it was because that was the last time he was really Anakin. No, it wasn't. He was really Anakin when he was lying there dying, talking to Luke. That's the whole point. It's the whole point of the films. Luke is trying to get Vader to come back to the light, to become Anakin again, to become his father. It's the whole point. And the whole point of that scene is to show that he'd done it. So in that scene, you either have to accept the fact that he's not Anakin, he's still Vader, and therefore Hayden Christensen coming back as Anakin for that last scene as a Force ghost is therefore right, or you have to go against everything that was being told in the films and everything that we were told after. That's the only way you're going to be able to accept that. Or you accept what we were told in the films and what was known and accepted for many, many years. And in that scene, and from George himself, and in that scene, he's no longer Vader, he's Anakin Skywalker. So he died as an old man, or an older man, as Anakin. Not as a 30-year-old, late 20s, early 30s-year-old Vader that you get in the film. The end of Return of the Jedi is a Force ghost. It doesn't make sense. Anyway, those are my minor gripes with the original trilogy, and a lot of them most of them actually come from the special editions because he tinkered, and in hindsight, a lot of the tinkering didn't make sense. The visual effects stuff I'm fine with, but tampering with characters I'm not fine with, because they work the first time round and they don't really work when you tamper with them. I hope you just strap yourselves in, because this might be I've only covered the first 3 films. So then we get the prequels, and this is where I think for the first time the Star Wars fan base fractured. It splintered. There were those that enjoyed the prequels and those that hated them. Being very, very general, I think the people who were the original trilogy fans, they've been there since the beginning, people like me, being very, very general, they tended to harbour a disdain for the prequels more than younger fans. Fans who, maybe their first introduction to Star Wars was maybe the special editions, or may have been the prequels. It doesn't really matter, but that tended to be the trend that I saw back then. Now, I can't statistically prove that. I was just, as somebody who used to frequent the Force.net forums, and just in and around the people that I knew, there was far more criticism of the prequels than there was the original trilogy. Far more disappointment with the original trilogy fans. Was I one of them? Yes and no. I enjoy the prequels overall. Revenge of the Sith in particular, I think is a really good film. I think it's very strong. And I think that if we'd had more of that, the prequels would have been outstanding. I don't think there would have been much doubt. Now, the trend at the time was for people to say that The Phantom Menace was the worst. It wasn't. For me, it was Attack of the Clones. I still have a lot of issues with that movie. The Phantom Menace still felt like old Star Wars to me. You've got an incredible lightsaber fight at the end of it that was way off the charts for anything that we'd seen before. Qui-Gon Obi-Wan versus Darth Maul. That dragged the film up. That and the pod race. The pod race was amazing, especially when you saw that at the cinema on a big screen. And it cut to the first person perspective from Anakin while he's piloting the pod race. It was incredible. It really was. But there were some silly moments in it that I could understand. People hated on Jar Jar. I didn't really mind him. He was no more of an annoyance than most other characters. I think a lot of the time was the fact that he was an entirely CGI character. And there's some parallels between that and AI generated characters today. People didn't like it. I think if it had been a puppet or a guy in a costume with an animatronic face, I don't think there would have been as much hatred, I could be wrong, but I just, that's what I feel. But he didn't really bother me that much, in all fairness. It's like the Ewoks. I didn't mind the Ewoks. I could see what George was going to do even as a kid. I thought they were cool. I thought they were funny. They brought a bit of levity into what was a very intense movie. Return of the Jedi, it's quite intense. There's a lot of darkness in that film. You have to have contrast, especially if you're making a film with kids in mind. Even Empire Strikes Back has a lot of levity in it. There's humour in it. You have to have contrast. And you can even go to Revenge of the Sith. There's still humour in it, even though it is, often said to be the darkest of all the Star Wars movies. And that, the humour comes from, towards the beginning. The battle droids now, they have more of a Looney Tunes voices to them. Even the super battle droids. People, again, might not have liked that, but I could see why George was doing it. George was very mindful of the messages that he was putting out there. He toiled away with that. You go back to the making of it, he didn't just put, Vader's Luke's father and leave it. He actually consulted a child psychologist over whether or not kids would believe what Vader said, because he was the bad guy and it had come from his mouth. And that's why he had the scene in Return of the Jedi with Yoda reiterating to Luke that he was his father, because Yoda's a good person and kids would trust Yoda more than they would trust Vader. So George was very, very mindful of what he was doing. And that does go into the prequel trilogy as well. So he was always aware that you're making a very dark film. You have to have some levity in it for people. Not even just for kids, but for everyone. Something that is relentlessly dark in the Star Wars universe in particular, which has always been about contrast, dark and light, seriousness and humour. You have to have that in there. And that's why I didn't mind Jar Jar. We're beginning a very dark chapter, the fall of Anakin, which, runs parallel to the rise of the Empire. The galaxy is about to become the dark place that we pick it up with in Star Wars. You can't tell that story without a huge amount of darkness being in it. And that's what we get. My issue with Attack of the Clones is it was like a video game. There's some really cool bits in it. But out of all of the movies, that also has the clunkiest dialogue. And it's not about acting performances. It's about the dialogue. Remember, actors are there to play a role as a director wants them to play. Anakin is the chosen one. He's not a normal person. He has very strong, conflicting emotions. He doesn't know how to communicate. He was brought up as a slave boy on a desert planet. He's then educated by the Jedi, who, and then trained by the Jedi and educated by the Jedi. The Jedi that's all about controlling emotions, being stoic. And this is for somebody who has a lot of emotions. He was older. He came to the Jedi Order, as they say in the Phantom Menace. It tells you he's too old. It mirrors with Luke. I mean, Luke was even older. And Luke, like his father, has strong emotional urges. It's an ongoing theme. And so, Anakin being a bit weird, it's just because because of where he comes from, what he's been exposed to in his life. He has that conflict. 1 minute he's calm and stoic, and it's where it perhaps doesn't work is how it was put on the screen. It was very clunky in how it was put on the screen for me. It was rushed, because George knew that he had to gallop towards the rise of the Empire and Darth Vader. When he's doing Attack of the Clones, he knows he's literally got one more movie to do this in, and that's a lot. So you're going to get compression in scenes, and the scene where Anakin is talking to Padme, and 1 minute he's talking as a young Jedi. We almost make sacrifices. I'm paraphrasing, we almost give things up, to do for the greater good. And Padme says, you've grown up. And that moment is like a switch for him. And then he starts whining like a brat. His emotions get the better of him. He doesn't know how to behave. And that, because of the way it was done in the movies, that becomes problematic from a storytelling perspective, from the audience's point of view. It's very much like Whiplash. And I could see what George was trying to do. He's trying to show that this is a guy torn between two ideologies, two ideas. Caring and loving people with extreme, and trying to be a Jedi. Those two things for him are just they're not things that he can cope with. And then you've got this guy, the third party Palpatine in the background, who's offering him a solution, like telling him the Jedi are wrong. You should be able to love and have emotions and all of this. But because it's truncated, and a lot of it is, we're told, not shown, that's, I think, where the problem lies with the prequels. It feels rushed. in a lot of cases. And ideas are not fully developed because of that. But the ideas are sound. The themes are sound. Well, that was. So I do get it that people do have issue with the prequels. I don't to that extent. When we go back, for us, they experienced the original trilogy, we're forgetting that we come part way through a story that has already been told. We're open in the middle of a book and essentially reading from the middle of the book to the end. And that's generally where all the best things happen. The prequels are there to world build, establish a world that is going to be destroyed in that trilogy. That's not a world that we have in the original trilogy. That world is gone. We're seeing the fall of that world. And I think that was the great difficulty people had, was seeing the fall of that world. And the world, you have to build it and destroy it in 3 movies. 3 movies that are about 2 hours long each. Back then, this was Lord of the Rings would come out after. The mammoth epic 3-hour films still weren't a thing. George wasn't able to deliver on that. That wasn't a roundly accepted thing at cinemas back then. Those epics were yet to return. If you look at the MCU, you can have 3-hour movies. But back then, George was still working to the 2-hour rule, really. So you're losing a lot of time to world build. And I still think he did a very good job. I didn't come away from the prequel trilogy with an enormous amount of unanswered questions. And it was clear that George was mindful of this as well. Because after he did the prequels, he then did the Clone Wars TV show. Because he wanted to fill in the gaps. He wanted to tell the stories and adventures that he couldn't in the film. He wanted to have the story of Anakin and Obi-Wan and build on their relationship, something that he couldn't do. Now, you could have argued, well, why didn't he start with with Anakin being Luke's age, and therefore being more of a character that you can build on? Because my answer to that is because you lose the power of seeing this innocent little boy with a really good heart fall into the dark side. You lose a lot of the tragedy there. If you just have him as a fully developed adult young man that Luke was, you lose a lot of the impact. That him being a boy of that age, 10 years old, a little kid, being at that station in his life is important. It's important from the narrative. You lose a lot of impact if you make him older. If you'd have had him like an 18-year-old in that first film. And of course, like I say, Revenge of the Sith is where George was really able to deliver. He'd built the world as best he could. Now he gets to destroy it and gets to put the galaxy into the place it is where we find it in the original trilogy. And I don't think it's any coincidence that people, vast majority of people will say Revenge of the Sith is the best of the prequels. And despite having some problems itself, is actually a really good Star Wars film, because we are planting one foot firmly into the world of the original trilogy. By the end of it, we're there, pretty much, even though we're a couple of decades away from those events. The world has turned, it's now an empire. We have an emperor, we have Vader, we have the last scenes of the movie, the Death Star being built, juxtaposed with the birth of Luke and Leia. And then we get to the Disney era. And this is where, if Star Wars fans were fractured, they were shattered. Whatever pretensions Disney had in unifying the fan base, they may have started out okay with The Force Awakens, but they completely fired a Death Star main weapon at that unity with The Last Jedi. I could go into a lot of details as to what I don't like about Disney Star Wars. There's some things I like. I think Andor is not only a great Star Wars story, but it's actually great television. It delivers world building unparalleled. You get to see the machinations of the day-to-day life of the Empire in operation. You get to see how things occur. How on earth do you build a Death Star without people knowing? How do you get the resources to fuel this war machine? And Andor delivers that really intelligently, and it's done in a way that is very mature. It doesn't pull punches. It doesn't gloss over things. It shows the lengths that rebellions have to go to, that even heroes in the rebellion that were never mentioned would never be commemorated because they got their hands bloody, because they too had to kill even people on their own side who were jeopardizing the future of the galaxy. They would have been unknowingly or unwittingly damaging to the rebellion. It was relentless in that sense. It built on the seeds that were sown in Rogue One, which I think is the best of the Disney Star Wars movies. But the main trilogy, after what I thought was a promising start, fell flat. It became pulled in directions for people that had their own ideas, and they put those ideas above what would best serve the story and the universe of Star Wars that had already been created. It did things with characters you cannot do. The Last Jedi ruined Luke Skywalker. Even Mark Hamill at the time said himself, that wasn't Luke Skywalker. He may have walked back some of his criticisms, no doubt, after Disney got hold of him. But they turned him into something he was never. You know, I don't have a problem with passing the torch, with the older actors dying in the movie. Sadly, you lost Carrie Fisher in real life, and that was a problem. That was a huge loss. But you can't inject your own themes onto a character that has long been established to not be that, especially if you're not going to show it. Having a couple of seconds flashback doesn't work. For a character to essentially do an entire 180 on who they are, you can't do that. You can't. And I think even Disney realised that. I mean, they tried to fix the issue by showing like the de-aged Mark Hamill, what some people call the skinwalker, Skywalker. But it was too late. You can't, as the saying goes, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Well, I suppose you can. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube there. But once that's out, it's out. And that character was ruined, in my view. And again, with The Last Jedi, there was some really good things in it. It's one hell of a beautiful movie to look at. But the characters were just nonsense. You cannot do what they did. I couldn't connect to the new characters as much. Not because I had any issue with the actors. I think they did a great job. And the idea of the characters I didn't have a problem with, but the execution of those characters was awful. I never felt that Rey was in any jeopardy. Finn was wasted from what he should have been and where he should have gone. And Poe Dameron was, well, he was just a character that was there to fit a moment. There was no consistency with him. 1 minute he's the best pilot in the Resistance, and the next minute he's not. Next minute he's being admonished for his actions. For what? It was ridiculous. Anybody with any brain knows that what actions he took at the beginning of The Last Jedi were the right ones. Any military leader would tell you that going on an operation with hopelessly outdated spacecraft up against a ship that is quite clearly called a fleet killer has the firepower to wipe out the Resistance in short order, to preserve the future of the Resistance, to wipe out that dreadnought, was the absolute right thing to do. The absolute right thing to do. Yes, they lost all of their bombers, but those bombers served no function or purpose or were needed at any point in the movie after. So there was no payoff for that. There was no payoff whatsoever. You literally have no scene later on where those bombers could have saved the day or could have changed anything. They would have equally have been quickly destroyed if they'd have been going up against the supremacy. In fact, they probably would have been destroyed quicker because you would have had the entire First Order fleet there. That's the implication of it. Or certainly a vast majority of it, plus a flagship. So, quite clearly destroying a ship that has enough firepower to annihilate your fleet, sacrificing a few old ships, and yes, there's a loss of life, which is tragic, but that's war. If you go back to the Battle of Midway, do you think that that would have been, was it Admiral Halsey in charge of the operation? I mean, I know Admiral Nimitz was in charge of the whole Pacific operation, but do you think that the loss of those torpedo fight bombers at the Battle of Midway, which were old and outdated, which drew the Japanese Zero fighters down to sea level and allowed the dauntless dive bombers to come in and wipe out the Japanese carrier task force? Yes, it was tragic, but those torpedo bombers were hopelessly out of date. Their sacrifice enabled America to win the Battle of Midway. Nobody will tell you that Nimitz was wrong. I'm using Nimitz. I can't remember the admiral. I don't think it was Admiral Halsey. I think he was sick back at Pearl Harbor. Was it Ray Spruance? Was it Admiral Spruance or Admiral Fletcher? I can't remember now. But in any event, it was entirely the right thing to do because they won the battle. The objective at the beginning of The Last Jedi is to evacuate. They couldn't do that with a fleet killer chasing them. The resistance would have been wiped out. So to admonish a pilot who also was out there himself risking his own life too, to take down that dreadnought was the right thing to do. And this is what I mean. Like, it was just things like that didn't make sense. And therefore, it just came across as being ridiculous to me. The more I watch it, the more I just think this was done for... It was an interesting storyline, badly implemented. If it was the idea of, we want to make Poe Dameron a better leader, then you did it entirely the wrong way. You had to have done it in reverse. You had to have had him care more about preserving people, his own pilots, and that could have led to the expense of the resistance. That was what it should have played out as. Rian Johnson played it out the wrong way round. He played it out in reverse. And that's the problem. He had an idea, but didn't know how to implement it. And that was really the theme of those Disney Star Wars movies. They were interesting ideas, but they just weren't enacted correctly. And for the criticisms that George had with the prequels, they apply 110% to the sequels. They're far worse. There are enjoyable moments in them. There are good performances. I like Adam Driver, I like Kylo Ren. But he feels like an underdeveloped character. I like the principal 3 heroic characters, but they're underdeveloped. I can't resonate with them. I wanted to. I've watched the movies enough times to try. But it's just not working for me. It's just not hitting home for me. And that's the problem with those films. They don't belong. They don't sit right. They don't feel like they belong in the Star Wars universe. They feel like fan films, and they're disjointed. You allowed people to run with their own ideas. They were given far too much leeway. I mean, the original trilogy had 3 different directors, but there was only ever one vision behind it all, and that was George Lucas. The prequel trilogies, George, for better or for worse, directed all himself, wrote, directed himself. But they had a cohesion to them. They didn't feel disjointed, whether you think they're good or not. They didn't feel disjointed. The sequel trilogy was people fighting with the Star Wars figures in a sandpit. J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson clearly had conflicting ideas for the show, for the series, for the story. And that was very abundant when you get to The Rise of Skywalker. Rise of Skywalker donates actual screen time to bashing The Last Jedi and to bashing the themes of The Last Jedi. And whereas some people do find that amusing, I think it's embarrassing. I think it was embarrassing for Disney, for Star Wars, for a story that you've got a very clear conflict of ideas being played out over a series of movies. Personal conflict of ideas. And no one will tell me there isn't, because there is. It's very clear. It's not even subtle. If you can't see it, I don't know what to say. How much clearer can you get than having the character of Luke Skywalker being the character of Luke Skywalker? Having lines like, at the beginning, towards the beginning of The Last Jedi, he tosses his lightsaber that Rey gives him, he tosses it over his shoulder. When Rey's about to throw it into the fire, the very same weapon, Luke returns from the netherworld as a Force ghost and catches the lightsaber and tells her a Jedi's weapon deserves more respect. His subsequent lines were, "I was wrong." People can say, well, that was done intentionally. No, it's also done because the character of Luke was not the character that J.J. Abrams approved of. Rey's parentage. Rian Johnson makes it that she was a nobody. J.J. Abrams makes her the granddaughter of Palpatine, hardly a nobody. A sharp contrast. And it's very breakneck in how it's done. It's a complete 180. It's not something that you get with a certain point of view. Like with Obi-Wan when he says that Vader betrayed and murdered Luke's father. Obi-Wan says, "I was right from a certain point of view." There is no point of view with that. They're very contrasting. What point of view can you possibly have? She was a nobody. She came from nothing. She came from, space trash, drunks. No, she's the heir to the Imperial throne. That is not coming from nobody. That is the absolute opposite of coming from nobody. There's no analysis or interpretation that you can put on that is contrary to that view. And this is the problem I have with Disney Star Wars. There's a lot of good stuff that is bogged down by poor execution and conflicting ideas. There's too many people that have been pulling in their own direction with their own ideas that do not service the overall story of the series. And this is why you get nonsensical things happening to established characters. This is why you have storylines that don't make sense in the context of a universe that's already been established. This is why you have, with the Acolyte, Yoda and Ki-Adi-Mundi saying in the prequels words along the lines of the Sith have been extinct for a millennia, which is 1,000 years. And yet you have a show that is set, 100 years before the events of The Phantom Menace with Sith in it. It's because of that. There's no care given to the cohesion of a story. People wanting to tell their own stories, and that's fine, and that's great, but you have to do it within the framework of a universe that has long been since established. You cannot do it and ignore all of that and expect the fans to embrace it. And that's been the problem with Disney Star Wars. There is good stuff in there. There are good ideas in there. There are good characters in there. But unfortunately, those ideas have been buried beneath personal agenda and personal stories and personal ideas. And as I say, there is nothing wrong with that, but you have to keep that within the framework of a franchise or framework of a set of stories that has already been established. You can't ignore them. Anyway, that's a big one today, and my battery's about to go. So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.